everybody? I'm David Grubb, and welcome to another episode of Hard to Paint. I am joined today by a very special guest. You may know him as Scoop B, but I know him as Brandon Robertson. He's a great friend of the show and one of the best NBA and culture reporters in the business, one of the hardest working people I know as well. Sir, I am so glad to have you back. It's been too long since we've had an on-the-record conversation.
Yeah, those on the record conversations they're good. Those off the record conversations, woo, they're good too. But nonetheless, it's always good to sit with you and talk with you. We've been doing this since about 2018, 2019, and
Yeah.
glad to grow with you.
Thank you so much, man. I appreciate you being along for the ride. You've always been, like a supporter of what I do, and like I said, some of those off the record conversations have been about just in this business. You know how easy it is to have false friends and pretend allegiances in this business, in any business. And I'll say that every time we've talked, every time we've interacted, anything we've done has always been straight up, honest, and productive. It's led to something. And whether it's just encouragement, whether it's an eye towards something else, I appreciate every time that we've gotten together.
And I plan for that to continue for the years to come, brother.
Absolutely. So I reached out to you to discuss a topic that seems to have the basketball world in a chokehold. And no, we're not talking about Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese or anything like that, but we're talking about this generational gap that seems to be getting wider between current players and fans and older players and fans. And Anthony Edwards is the latest player to chime in, but we've also had social media campaigns over the last several months like we're done with the 80s and the Jordan has no left hand, all those types of things and the hype around those types of movements and so on. I am kind of in a place where Dominique Wilkins, who's on um, the podcast with Matthew Barnes and Steven Jackson, where essentially he told them, hey, we don't want this generation to have to shit on us, basically, to get their props. We didn't do it to the generations before us. Why is this happening now, kind of? And I just want to get your thoughts on it because you and I are both products of coming of age in basketball really around the same time. I'm a little bit older, but our you got an early jump on this, and you were there in the 90s when that playground was kind of exploding. And here we are 30 years later, watching hoops still, loving the game bigger than any one player. Where are you on this debate?
I think temperament is everything, and I'll give you an example. Um, I don't know what I don't know. I don't know the 70s, and I was born in 85. So by the time 90 hit, I knew what was going on and studied it from 91 on. But what you don't know is what you don't know, and temperament is what it is. I'm old enough to remember when Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was on his retirement tour. But if I don't know something, I'd ask my uncles, I'd ask aunts, I'd ask play uncles, and what have you. Um, I'll add that when you're dealing with that level of temperament, you have to apply the same thing to current players. So um, I've been in situations where I've been in locker rooms, and when the locker room's kind of dead, and you're sitting down and you're catching up with players that you really know, like that, and you're sitting in a chair next to them, and there have been players who were born in the 90s that have asked me straight up, "School, what was it like watching Michael play?" And again, that goes with temperament. Um, I won't name names because it's not really about the player; it's more about the temperament. And I'll add that that kind of applies to Anthony Edwards in that particular situation. I'm sure Anthony gives me the vibes that he has present parents, present uncle that watched it, that can school them. That I'm sure after he said what he said, I believe it was the Fanatics Fest panel in New York at the time a couple of weeks ago, that was where they kind of guided him in that conversation. And I think it's a gift and a curse of being a top superstar or budding superstar in the league, and then you make comments and people hold you at face value without the proper context. You made a point about the generation before, and Dominique Wilkins, of course, we're paraphrasing what he said about we didn't do it. They didn't do it publicly. Probably they were talking shit. The difference is, I think Michael and the Bulls, or that generation of basketball players, were probably the first generation to publicly dog the Pistons because of their disdain for Isaiah. And, I've had this conversation with Isaiah where he said to me, champions did not dog champions. And that gave me some perspective of where that ultimately went. And, today's day and age, today's player is just like today's younger kid. To get respect, you got to give respect. So you're dealing with so many dynamics and nuances there. I think that answered your question.
Yeah, I certainly understand that no matter what the generation, when you're 20, 22, 25, whatever, you think you got it. You think you figured the world out to an extent. I know in my life I did. You think you have a perspective that no one's ever had. You think you're seeing the world in ways that no one ever has. And I think we all go through that. But like you said, the big difference has become because yeah, I'm sure when any hotshot rookie comes in the league, there's a point where you look at everybody like, I can beat these old dudes. I watched him on TV. He's not that good or whatever. And then you accomplish some things and you feel like, yo, I'm better than some of these older guys. But at the same time, like you said, I think there's this push, this constant engagement, and yes, it's a product of the times, but it does seem that basketball has embraced this more than any other sport. The constant discussions of who's on your Mount Rushmore, the constant discussions of who's the GOAT, the constant discussions of who's more skilled. You don't see that conversation so much in other sports.
You see it in football some. I had a conversation
Some,
with Brandon Graham of the Eagles recently, and I asked him who was on his Philly Mount Rushmore of quarterbacks. And traditionally in Philly, you give Jaworski, Donovan McNabb. You may throw Nick Foles in there, but he gave a whole different element, and the element left off McNabb, but had Michael Vick, had Jalen Hurts, and a few other characters there. There was no Randall, and I think what you're seeing with these younger generations is kind of what happened with our age bracket, where we didn't see Kareem play. We saw the end of Magic play, and we start off with Michael. It's just a coming of age, and I think I really realized that more recently when I asked Kenny Smith a question about 8 years ago, 17, 18, 19, 21, 22. I asked him in 2016 if Michael hadn't retired, would the Rockets still have won those 2 championships? And he said we would have beat them, no question. And the reason why that was significant was because when it was run back on television, you had Byron Scott and you had Scottie Pippen on television discussing it. And you had 80s Byron, 90s Scottie, and they're kind of vetting it. And that question was just so futuristic. And I think that was a precursor to where we are now, particularly in digital media. I also have to kind of put a line of demarcation here. The only reason why Anthony Edwards saying that is such a big deal is because there's no basketball on, and any little thing that's going to go on the internet and streams is going to get clicks. I think it would be more of a non-issue had this been November or December, but here we are now in the beginning of the school year, and with baseball towards the end and football getting ready to start. I think that for the game of basketball, there is no such thing as one GOAT, because it clogs the lane of people's greatnesses there. Because I think where we are in basketball now, Michael is the GOAT in my mind, but that's because I grew up watching him. But I also have to take into consideration that someone like Anthony Edwards grew up with Kobe as the alpha. And while Kobe was the alpha, Tim Duncan was still running things. So I think, it depends. Perspective is everything. But I also just think that you're not just seeing it in basketball. You're seeing it in hip hop music. That same Mount Rushmore and GOAT conversation. If Jay-Z is the Michael Jordan standard, Lil Wayne is the Kobe standard, and Drake is the LeBron standard. I think
that's a really good comparison.
Yeah, but then here's the thing, right? So if those are the 3 standards, you still have to implement Nas. You still have to implement
Biggie,
Busta Rhymes, and
I think you have to put LL Cool J as like the Wilt Chamberlain of hip hop, in that there was no real. He's the template for the solo rap star. Like,
yes,
to this day, anybody who's trying to be a solo rap star, you are following the LL Cool J template.
and even though I made the Drake and LeBron comparison, there's from a stylistic standpoint, not from the comparison
Right.
with basketball to hip hop. Like, there are elements of LL Cool J from a branding standpoint that remind me of Drake, and vice versa. The difference is Drake didn't, or rather, LL Cool J didn't get destroyed by cannabis. Drake, on the other hand, got destroyed by Kendrick Lamar. That's a whole different conversation. But when we're talking about a branding and a stylistic perspective, there are things that remind me there are similarities between the two for sure. But then, again, when you're talking about basketball and you're talking about music, like the Busta Rhymes reinventing themselves has a realm there. 50 Cent going from rapper to hook man to businessman to creator of movies and television shows. To me,
Ice Cube.
posthumously, that is very Drake. That is very Kobe like, with the books and some of the other things. As far as Ice Cube and the entrepreneurial perspective, there's a space for that. Like, even from a perspective, I don't want to leave the West Coast out. There's the Snoop Dogg element. There's the Warren G element. There's just so many other people, and I think that goes back to basketball. There's so many people that are just so great that you can't just encapsulate it into one, two, or three people. And it kind of ties into a conversation I had with Shaq some years ago, where he kind of equates the basketball landscape like McDonald's, where everybody knows the Big Mac is the it thing on the menu, but there's still the nuggets, there's still the fillet of fish, there's still the fries. Everybody doesn't want a sandwich. Some people may go in there for a drink. So you gotta put in the John Stocktons, the Karl Malones, the Dominique Wilkinses, the Ron Harpers, all those guys. So it's a difficult conversation that is an age and gender debate constantly.
Yeah. Like, one of the things, I'm a guy, like, I was born in 75. So the first team that I was really aware of are the 80s Lakers and them and the Celtics. Of course, that was the dominant thing on television. So when I have arguments with people, I am not a person who stands on the one GOAT theory. You know what I mean? Like, I believe, like Michael used to say, like Kareem used to say, I'm a Kareem guy, in the sense that if you're talking careers, it's hard to argue that anybody has ever had a more influential and impactful from high school. He was the most important high school player of his time, opened up the West Coast by being the first New Yorker to go to California and really make Los Angeles a basketball city in that regard. Then he goes to Milwaukee, and immediately he's one of those players who comes in and has unparalleled success as a young player, wins a championship in, I believe, his third season with the Bucks. Takes that franchise. It takes them 50 more years to get back to that level without him. Goes on, has a Hall of Fame career, obviously, with the Lakers, sets the all-time scoring record that lasted for 30-plus years until LeBron James comes along and breaks it. A much longer period of time between Wilt setting it and Kareem coming by and smashing it. All of those things, the 6 championships, that Kareem has, the 6 MVP awards that he also has, the oldest finals MVP, all those things. How can you disregard him when it comes to the game? And I think that when we talk about, I think there's a skill conversation that people want to have. And like you said, do you appreciate guard play? Do you appreciate the guy who handles the ball? Or do you appreciate the power of the post, which is a game that has changed and has moved away from post play, but now seems also to be gravitating back towards big men at this stage of the 2020s. So it's a very interesting thing. And we get caught up in trying to break down 75 years of basketball history into 4 or 5 players. And if for comparison, when we talk about Mount Rushmore, when they built that, there were only like 20 presidents. You know what I'm saying? 4 out of 20. You were picking 4 out of 20. There are 46 presidents at this stage. You're talking 1 out of 11 for the 4 that are on Mount Rushmore. We're talking, there are 30,000 players who played in the history of this league. And you're trying to boil it down to 5 players across eras, across game styles, all these things. And I think it's just we're having too much of a reductionist conversation about a game that we really love and have watched evolve.
I mean, I break it down even simpler. So I agree with everything you said. First and foremost, I also think that we're at a point where um, even the point guard position um, is so dynamic uh, because people are now having these discussions about whether Steph Curry is better than Magic, and I don't and basketball is not an individualistic sport. First of all, it's a team sport, but um, Magic Johnson was probably one of Del Curry's peers or close to it, Steph's dad. But I think when you look at the point guard position, so many guys get overlooked. Like if we're talking about Magic Johnson, Jason Kidd, Gary Payton, Steph Curry, the Terrell Brandons, the
Mark
the
Price.
the Mark Prices, the Andre Millers will get overlooked naturally because they're not the sexy name or the sexy location. And I just think we're at a point where we just have so much talent. And I'll add, when you talk about positions, you brought up the whole Kareem portion of it. Um, traditionally, big men don't sell sneakers. I think that's part of it. Shaq was the exception to the rule, and Shaq was marketable from being a rapper to being an actor to doing all those different and being a DJ and just being so many different things. Shaq was the exception to the rule in an era where um, how we look at Kobe and we say that Tim Duncan was winning and was a placeholder. So too was Shaq during Michael's run after championship two in '92 when Shaq was drafted. And so I think that first of all, it depends on where you look at the position, one, and then two, football has the same problem. The wide receiver, the cornerback, the running back, and the quarterback make all the money. Deion Sanders as a corner was also like Shaq, where he rapped, he acted, he danced, he was singing, and he hung out with everybody. He was the cool Southern kid that New York accepted. And to me, it's all about marketability. I'll never forget when I watched The Last Dance, and Michael Jordan talked, or someone in the documentary talked about how Michael or his team were watching tennis players and how they marketed themselves. And Michael took a page out of that book and marketed themselves. Like, marketability plays a big factor into how you're received and you're perceived by the national and the international audience. And I think that's why the guard, the two guard, both guard positions, the small forward, are marketable in ways that are similar to actors and tennis stars and rappers.
This is kind of the gift and the curse of David Stern's vision for the NBA, because he wanted to grow the game and he saw that the way to grow it once, you had the advent of Magic and Larry was to put it in the terms of individuals. Because I felt like, there was a noticeable shift as we got towards the end of the 80s and into the 90s as Michael really started to ascend, where the lead was, which players you were going to see that night. You know what I mean? And the 90s were really the time when that happened. Because I would say in the 80s, you had guys like, let's take an Alex English. And people don't realize that Alex English scored more points than any other player in the NBA in the 1980s. But like you said, there's Alex English played in Denver. Alex English never won anything. And his game, if I asked you to tell me what's Alex English's signature move, 99% of people won't be able to tell you because it's lost in a way. Though we have film of it, it's lost to the past. It's not something that we recycle. We don't talk about him. He's not a part of the cultural discussion. So I think the NBA, more so than the NFL and baseball, which baseball holds on to its past like sometimes like a grudge, refuses to let it go. And football is very much, there's this kind of tacit respect for the fact that these dudes put their lives on the line for this game. I think basketball, because it is this constant marketing of the individual, for better or for worse, it leads to this place where we lose some of the appreciation for greatness.
And I'll add this. I agree with everything you said, and I'll add, when you think of Alex English, you'll think more about the throwback jersey with the Legoland pieces on the Denver Nuggets jersey at Mitchell and Ness than you will the player. Same with someone like
Outside of New York, Bernard King.
yeah,
Bernard King is one of those
but
guys.
mm, Bernard. Well, this generation doesn't have the same
Mhm.
reference for him, but I think Bernard gets double cred because he played for the Knicks and he's from Brooklyn, and because of the high school he went
Okay.
to. I think someone like Ewing may be a better example, maybe, um, because, and I don't even know if that's an example. I think
Moses Malone.
yeah, yeah. Moses Malone is somebody that most kids will know because you'll hear Charles Barkley talking about him on TV, and the fact that I believe Charles was his rookie, and he told
Mm-hmm.
the story about how he bought all them cars and he told him to take them back. You know him more for being some people will know him more for being attached to Charles and being a Sixers legend than you will. You got to really be a basketball nut at this point to like,
Mm-hmm.
if you're below 25 and you're knowing who Moses Malone is because you hung with your uncles.
Right, the George Gervins, the David Thompsons. It's just so many. Even a David Robinson now, who is kind of viewed at the end of his career. People look at him as Tim Duncan's partner with that regard, because that was the end stage of David Robinson and Tim was ascending. But people forget that David was a quadruple double guy who could, perform that way, was athletically as good as any center we've ever seen at that position. And I think, yeah, I think there's a way to have the push and the pull. Certainly nobody wants to step on the current guys. The game is moving forward. I love young players. I love watching them come into the league and develop. I think part of the disconnect also comes from the way the game is coached now and who is doing the coaching at the younger levels. There are fewer of those older guys in the coaching game at the high school, the AAU level. What you're getting is more former players or guys who are fame adjacent, I'll say, who know the kid or trainers of the game or something like that, but didn't play in the league or something like that. And there's much more focus on individual skill sets, individual accomplishment. And I think that grasp of how great players fit into teams. If I showed you Wes Unseld's stats, a lot of people today would ask, why is he even in the Hall of Fame? You know what I mean? If I showed you, some stats of some of these all-time greats, of Gus Williams, there's a lot of guys now that people would say, I don't get his
Yeah,
value because you had to be there.
it's interesting you say that, and I'm saying it for context, not to spark a debate. With all of the hoopla about Cheryl Swoops and Caitlin Clark, I saw someone put up a graphic comparing Swoops' stats her rookie year to Caitlin Clark's stats her rookie year. And people were making comments about Swoops' stats at a time when the WNBA was in its infancy stage. And someone said what you just said. They said these were her stats at a different point in the WNBA when it got started. And I think stats can be deceiving without proper context.
That part, the discernment. There are a long time ago when I was at a Bible study at Wake Forest University.
Mm-hmm.
Pastor spent a night. We were talking about wisdom, and the conversation was about Solomon and his asking God for wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
But he also asked for discernment, because there's one thing to have we are overwhelmed with information in the current age. We have more information at our fingertips than anyone in the history of the world. That information, as I think you rightly point out, can be too much if you don't know how to apply it. And I think it's easy because we have so much access to numbers and so many numbers and so many advanced stats that it's easy to support your argument in one way or another by pulling and cherry picking stats. But without the context of actually watching gameplay and seeing how somebody's impacted by a defense, how somebody's you have to take all the things, travel, you have to take the historical situations, the lack of training. People say, well, these guys were smoking and stuff, because that's what America was like. You were literally seeing smoking ads in magazines telling you it was healthy for you. So yeah, players smoked in the locker room at halftime. It was just a different era. And I think we have to understand that. I think one of the biggest things I've always believed, and athletes talk about this a lot, greatness endures. If I take Michael Jordan today, if I took LeBron James 40 years ago and I drop them into those eras, their mindset more so than their physicality is what determined their greatness.
Yeah, and here's the thing: as documentors of that process, some people are qualified to comment on it, and some people are not. And by that I mean this: temperament plays a big part. What Anthony Edwards may not know today, he'll learn tomorrow, and he'll be better able to give his informed opinion. Um, while many people did not agree with JJ Redick and what he said about farmers and firemen and things of that sort, it sparked up a conversation that had many NBA legends annoyed and also confused. But it takes certain legends to comment and respond to that. So somebody like a Rick Barry, as much of a firecracker as he
That's
is,
a good way to put it.
um, he is a documenter of that culture. In the same way that 20, 30 years from now, I believe JJ Redick will be further educated because he will be more accomplished as both a coach, having played, having had an excellent collegiate career. The same way that certain people who are level-headed, like the people who are in their 40s now, are respected. That are legends now are respected just as much as people who were in their 60s when our parents' generation revered them. And so someone like a Stephon Marbury, for example, is very well respected by the Jalen Brunsons. And those, they're able to have a balanced opinion, both young and old. So everybody is not qualified or mature enough to give opinions, which turn into facts, which turn into media, viral media moments that can shape the next generation.
One of the things you do is cultivate relationships with athletes, not just for your personal gain, but just as part of your job. You understand that having these relationships and understanding them and their thought processes is important to what you do. When you do talk about greatness with them, when you do talk about in general, when you talk about the things that they look for in players, even of the different generations you've covered, more times than not, do you see similarities in what they're looking for? And ultimately, do you feel like this is a bridge that can be, narrowed, not just by time, but also by expanding the perspective a bit?
I think coming with an open mind and willing to learn, you definitely learn a lot from all generations. I've been around the league since 1997, and prior to that, my family owning two successful shoe businesses in New York City and Manhattan. I was around the Dominique Wilkinsons and the Spud Webbs as a baby, and the Hakeem Olajuwons. And so, the one thing that I find, similar from '97 to now is the cadence of the conversation and people's opinions. I think the shaking hands and kissing babies will never change. The vehicles in which we disseminate that information has. And so in conversations, the one conversation that I think that I was challenged and it gave me some perspective was one that I had, with Hall of Famer Isaiah Thomas, where he asked me one time. He basically said, like, can you? He asked me to expand my mind to look outside of just when I fell in love with the game of basketball and Michael Jordan as the point person, because Michael had to grow, and it didn't come from a spirit of hate. It came from a conversation of looking outside of that. I don't know the NBA to be successful prior to Michael Jordan's dominance in '91, but he asked me, he said, I bet you thought that Michael just came in the league just dominating and winning from the door. He had to grow. And I can most closely associate that with LeBron trying to get his first championship, or that quest from '03 to '07, and then losing in the '07 finals to the Spurs. And then Tim Duncan having that conversation, I know this is going to be your league in a few years, but, thanks for giving me this win this year. And then, going to Miami and then losing in 2011, and then 2012 beating the Thunder, and then the Thunder figuring things out, and then ultimately Harden leaving, going to Houston, and then KD going to Golden State. So you see those similarities where you look at the 90s and you see Grant leaving the Bulls and going to the Orlando Magic and then competing in the 95 finals with the Magic against, the Rockets. And then you see Michael leave and play baseball and then come back. To me, I compare that to LeBron switching teams and figuring it out. There's rhythms and there's cadences that I see that are similar between the 90s and now, but I think each era is each era, and I also lean on a conversation that I had with Dr. J, where he said that during his time, they were comparing guys like Connie Hawkins back then. So this is really nothing new. It's just technology has expanded.
Absolutely. In journalism, how important were mentors to you in shaping your perspective of the game? I came up in a much different newsroom culture. I had to do the grind work of being in a regular newsroom that had veteran reporters, sports reporters who were 20, 30 years my senior, who put books in my hand, who, told me stories about games that they had attended that I could never have seen to get more perspective on players, who introduced me. I remember the first time I was introduced to the film of Wilt Chamberlain running track and seeing, just how physically dominant he was in all phases and hearing stories of his strength and talking to guys like Willis Reed and talking to David Thompson and talking to Dr. J. I had the opportunity to interview him once and just hearing these things and how they are, I can't remember who it was. I think it was Oscar Robertson, but a lot of his peers, in particular, if you ask him the best player they played against or they ever saw, it's going to be Oscar. There's an entire generation of people that will, for them, Oscar is the greatest player they ever saw or competed against. And I think that that conversation ultimately, I think if it brings up older names so that we can enjoy what they did in building the game that we love today, not to deride them, not to diminish what they accomplished, but to the same way we do with a Babe Ruth or a Ken Griffey Jr. or a Barry Bonds in comparison to Aaron Judge today, we don't have to lose the appreciation for any of these guys to love this game as we do.
Well, to your question about the mentors, and I like your perspective. I think for me, it started in community. I had an uncle um, who introduced me to the game of basketball in the 90s. He ran a basketball league in Harlem called Citywide. So, Stefan came out of there, Rod Strickland, Bernard King, and his brother Albert King, and more. And so I was around him when he was around a lot of those grassroots people. And then that expanded to, when I got my start and was in the locker room as a kid with Woj, was around Chris Broussard, Stephen A. Smith as well back in 97, 98. And so I watched them from afar. And then, when I was in college, Chris Broussard actually took me to ESPN when he was there for a weekend, and I got a tour of the campus and the newsroom, and and I actually met a young Swing Cash who was still in the WNBA at the time, and she was hosting NBA Fast Break with Chris Broussard, and then that relationship carried on for years, and she's now with the Pelicans and in a front office role, and she's doing her thing as a VP. So I remember her leaving production meetings and going to stores to work out at UConn during her off season. But and that carried over. Just my buddy Justice Hill out in Cleveland, a mentor of mine, and more, and learning just about the nuances of baseball writing and he's shared with me how much the baseball journalism culture back then reminds him so much of basketball culture now. Very much a country club, very much a cliquish situation, and they either love you or hate you. And if you follow my work, it could go either way. So, learning that realm of it and what it was like in the 80s and the 90s then and now, it's that. So when it comes to just the full-fledgedness of learning my history, I got that from, learning it in New York, and then from the business side of it, learning it from the Chris Broussards and the Justice Hills, and other people in that regard. And I think it's just kind of developing your style and talking to people and kind of just documenting it all.
And I always enjoy talking to you because I think it's just a fantastic perspective, and at the end of it, the genuine love for the game of basketball comes through, and I think that that's always what you try to convey through your work, and that's what I try to convey through mine. That we love basketball, and we want to see the game in an elevated place, and that the conversations are elevated in that regard. I think there's always a room for passion. I want passionate people around me discussing something that I love. But let's again, it's a product of certainly of the times, but I think we can channel it, and I think it's our responsibility in a way, and I embrace it. I love talking to younger reporters and content creators and things like that when they want perspective on the things that I have seen over the course of my lifetime and my career. Because I mean, what else are we doing this for if we don't share that information?
Not a damn thing.
Before I let you go, I'm gonna have one fun question with you though. If
Okay.
you did have to put together a team of 5 for your life, the aliens come down like it's Space Jam, and it's for your life, and you putting together a team of 5 of your 5. It ain't gotta be, this is not like you said for argument's sake. Who are you taking to win that game for your life?
Magic at the point. Um, Michael at the two. Um, LeBron at the three. Uh, Wimby at the four, and Shaq at the five.
And I can't not let you go without asking you a Pelicans related question because you bring Wimby into it. I look at this season. And for the Pelicans in particular, because most of my audience is based out of New Orleans and they love the Pels. But I look at the Pels and you see the length of a Wimby. We talked about this kind of briefly at the beginning, this return to size.
Mhm.
You look at the Western Conference, you look at the Eastern Conference. Whether you're talking about the Celtics with Porzingis and Horford up front, Jason Tatum at 6'10 playing the small and the power forward spots, Philly with the size that they have, Paul George, who can play the 2 to 3 and the 4, Joel Embiid. The Knicks have a lot of length with Mitchell Robinson and as some of the guys that they have coming off the bench there, some leapers. And of course, in the West, it's Jokic and Gobert and Towns and Wimby. And the Rockets have a three-headed center with Adams and Shingun and Jabari Smith. Pelicans have gone the opposite direction, and they've gotten much smaller in this offseason. They only have 3 players on their entire roster taller than 6'9". With all the perimeter talent they have this early in the stage, and I know we're still almost a month away, well, more than a month away from training camp almost. But what do you make of what the Pelicans have done this offseason with their small ball approach?
I like DeJounte Murray at the point next to CJ McCollum, who's running two basically, even though he's really controlling the tempo of the game. I like what the Pelicans have done. I like Yves Missy, a guy that I've been tracking since his workouts with the Pelicans, and ultimately, was drafted with the 21st pick by NOLA by David Griffin. But when I look at this Pelicans team, I place them in as well as the Oklahoma City Thunder in the same box of just a returning team that has added some pieces that's only going to make them better. And I think that the biggest puzzle piece will be what ultimately the Pelicans do with Brandon Ingram, and hopefully they give him his money. But Murphy is definitely a consolation prize if he walks a year from now, meaning Ingram. But I do like the team as is. I think the question that is still going to have to be answered is, the elasticity and longevity of Zion Williamson for a whole season. The playoffs, it was interesting to see how he disappeared, and hopefully those questions are answered at the big man position. Um, you know, you are pretty small, but I also think that while the Celtics and Porzingis prove that you still need a big man defensively in order to win, and the Mavs succumbed to that wall of Porzingis when healthy, I do think that if you can consistently outrun another team in the gym and you play good defense, things can happen in your favor as well. So I do think that the Western Conference has gotten better, but I still do think when it's all said and done, it's likely to run through the Timberwolves or Oklahoma, and I think that the Pelicans are a close third.
I appreciate your perspective, and we'll definitely check in with each other during the season as well. I'm sure we have plenty to discuss once the NBA season gets going.
For sure.
Tell the folks how they can keep up with you and all the things that you do.
Scoopy Radio. We have everybody that comes on weekly, sometimes double. And in addition to that, follow me on Twitter at Scoopy, Instagram at Scoopy, and check it out.
Folks, that is Brandon Robinson, better known as Scoop B, and this has been Hard to Paint. I will talk to y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.